Welcome everyone to this evening's event, an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, the only plausible two-state solution, a discussion with Bernard Avishai. My name is Norman Goda. I am the Norman and Irma Brayman Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Florida, and also the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies here and at UF. Before we begin, let me note that tonight's event and our entire fall series on contemporary Israel and its challenges is generously sponsored by the Gary R. Gerson Lecture Series. Let me also note that we have a very full and most exciting slate of events this fall, from next week's events on Leopold and Loeb's murder trial with Sarah Imhoff, to our end of the semester talk by writer Dara Horn on her provocative and disturbing new book, People Love Dead Jews. Visit our website to learn more, jst.ufl.edu. That's jst.ufl.edu. But tonight, we are most pleased to welcome Bernard Avishai. Dr. Avishai has taught business and government at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, MIT, Duke, and is currently a visiting professor of government at Dartmouth College. He was a Guggenheim Fellow, and he is the author of numerous books, including The Tragedy of Zionism, How Its Revolutionary Past Haunts Israeli Democracy, A New Israel, Democracy in Crisis, and The Hebrew Republic, How Secular Democracy and Global Enterprise Will Bring Israel Peace at Last. He is a regular contributor on Israeli affairs to The New Yorker, and he has written many articles for Harper's, The New York Review, The Nation, and The New York Times Magazine. He's a former editor, too, of the Harvard Business Review and former international director of intellectual capital at KPMG. Not usual for an academic. Moderating tonight's event will be my colleague, Roy Holler. Dr. Holler is an assistant professor of Israel studies at the University of Florida. He began his career as a journalist with Israeli Army Radio. He joined the University of Florida faculty after receiving his PhD in literature and Jewish studies at Indiana University. And for our university, he teaches a wide array of courses, ranging from Holocaust memory in Israel to the Israeli-Arab conflict on stage and screen. He is the winner of the 2020 Salo Baron New Voices in Jewish Studies Prize by Columbia University and Fordham University, and his current book project is on passing and the politics of identity in Israeli and African American literature. Dr. Avishai, Dr. Holler, I will step off the virtual platform and leave the event in your very capable hands. Everyone, enjoy the discussion, and I will leave it to that.
Thank you, Dr. Goda, and thank you, Dr. Avishai, and thanks for all the audience members who are joining us today. And we are in for a treat. I find it hard to remember the last time I was in such a hopeful conversation about our future. Let me take a second just to explain how this will work. The concept is a webinar, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. So we're not going to do a talk in a traditional way, but due to the nature of the topic, I'm sure we'll have a nice conversation going this evening. So for those of you who are interested in pitching in, the Q&A section is open. Please feel free to post your comments and questions. You could use your name or you can remain anonymous, and Dr. Avishai will try to respond to as many of you as possible. And there are quite a few with us tonight. So I first want to commend Professor Avishai for bringing the idea of an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation to the op-ed pages of the New York Times. It was February this year, right? You co-authored along with Sam Bahor a really enlightening column titled "Want Israeli-Palestinian Peace? Try Confederation." And these are times in which we've seen many predominant thinkers really give up on the Middle East. and yet this idea of a confederation, which floated around for really decades, suddenly caught momentum and generated traction, a lot because of your op-ed. And I know it's been pretty busy lately presenting your philosophy. So we're very thankful that you're here at the Center of Jewish Studies, and for the greater Gainesville community who came to listen. So I think it'll be beneficial if we can perhaps start by you presenting your key argument before we move on to discussion and taking Q&A from the audience.
Thank you, Roy. I'm going to start, alas, with a little PowerPoint, and I will try to be as succinct as possible, but I think that it will help to put some guide rails on our discussion, because the phrase the term confederation has been kicked around and means a lot of different things to different people. So I want to be very clear about how I'm using it. Confederation is not an alternative to a traditional two-state solution. It's not an alternative to the Oslo process. In my view, it's the reason, the absence of serious talk about confederation is the reason why the Oslo process leading to a two-state solution failed. Two states are inevitable. Two states are just a way of saying there are two distinct national entities, and one has to stop occupying the other. The question is, how can you get that in a atmosphere of productive conversation that will lead to peace over a generation? All we mean by confederation is that states have interests, they are sovereign, but their interests often lead them to create institutions of interdependence. And in the case of Israel-Palestine, the common interests seem especially obvious, and I'll say much more about that in a moment. First, I want to be clear that confederation is not an attempt to reconcile the maximal ideas on both sides. There are Palestinian refugees who say they want to return to their homes in Israeli territory. There are Jewish settlers who may wish to remain in place in Palestinian territory. Confederation is not an effort to placate both. It's not an effort to say, maybe what we should do is notionally give each state sovereignty over the whole territory and find some kind of political institutions where they can fight out their battles. No, we're talking about two separate states that are engaging in mutually interested interdependence because they find that interdependence inescapable. If there were not a single Jewish settler, if there were not a single returning Palestinian refugee, confederation would still be necessary between Israel and Palestine. Also, finally, along these lines, confederation is not one model. When you're talking about states that have interests in cooperation, there could be a proliferation of models. Right now, I mean, I'm Canadian by origin, so speaking of confederation as a Montrealer is sort of second nature, but there's also a confederal system in the EU. Benelux has had its own sort of tortured tortured but inescapable confederal arrangement for generations. And each confederation emerges from its own conditions. But nevertheless, if there were no other confederations in the world, if there were no other confederations in history, it would have had to have been invented for this one case. Why? First of all, simply let's talk about scale. And maybe the best way to do that is to show you. Here is Israel, north of Beersheba. Everything south of Beersheba is desert, remember? So here is Israel, north of Beersheba. We're talking about something like 8,000 square miles, something like 14 million people. That's Greater Los Angeles. We're talking about an area, the scale of which is really that of two interlocking city-states, together the size of Greater Los Angeles. It's Los Angeles County and Orange County. So, you know, we are talking, therefore, about states that have jurisdictions, when exercised, that will necessarily impinge on the jurisdictions of the neighbor. Separation is not hypothetically even possible. And when, you know, part of the problem of introducing the question of confederation is that we are sort of living with two generations of people who've been talking, I think, in rather fatuous ways about divorce, about, you know, the two sides getting a divorce, or, you know, Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, famously said, "Hem sham anachnu po." We're, you know, they're there, we're here. Well, they're there and we're here, but they're there is 25 miles away. There is an area that is simply too small to allow for the kind of separate national life that each side might well have wished to have. And this leads to very significant problems that cannot be solved outside of a confederal model. First of all, security, the fragility of the security situation. Each side, Israelis and Palestinians together, are going to have a large minority that opposes the other side's statehood. I'd even be prepared to say, if you take Khalil Shikaki's polls, if you take the pollsters in Israel, we're talking about between 30 and 35% of people on both sides who are really prepared for a fight to the finish, and would feel quite comfortable inflicting, or having some subset of themselves inflicting atrocities on the other side. In that situation, it's impossible to have a security arrangement which is not a collective security arrangement. If you have one side saying to the other side, "Oh, we just had this attack coming from your side, and if you don't take care of it, I'm going to attack you." If that becomes the model, polarization, security polarization becomes inevitable immediately. And that's how the Oslo process broke down. We have to remember that if here is Ben Gurion Airport, and here is the green line over here, it's a red line here, but this is Palestine over here. That's about 8 miles. Planes that fly in to land at Ben Gurion Airport almost inevitably fly over Palestinian territory. One shoulder-fired missile coming from Palestinian territory to a plane landing in Ben Gurion Airport would mean closing down Israeli aviation for months. This is the Temple Mount, right? This is the Haram al-Sharif, and here is Al-Aqsa Mosque over, well, you can't quite see it here, but Al-Aqsa Mosque is right over here. 300 yards from Al-Aqsa Mosque are numerous yeshivot that would like to take down Al-Aqsa Mosque or blow up Al-Aqsa Mosque for the purpose of building a third temple. We cannot imagine a future in which atrocities will not happen. What we need desperately is a collective security environment in which each side is contributing to security cooperation, which we actually have on the ground already. It's just not openly acknowledged and defended politically. But we need to have security cooperation so that if there is an atrocity, it becomes an atrocity against a cooperating center. It becomes an attack on a consensus that is being defended by majorities on both sides that are coming together and are trying to advance the moral prestige of their cooperation, and not a situation where one side is blaming the other for the extremists on their side. But this leads to other ways of thinking. When you think about the scale involved here, and don't forget the scale, right? I mean, Herzliya, which is the high-tech capital of Israel, to Nablus, where the Palestinian stock exchange is. It's the second largest, but probably most dynamic of the Palestinian cities. We're talking about 25 miles. That's the distance between Newark Airport and Kennedy Airport. And when you have that kind of proximity, it's inevitable that each side trying to exercise its jurisdiction in, say, water and sewage, electricity and desalination, telecommunication spectrum, right? I mean, this is the heart of every entrepreneurial commercial community. So the division of telecommunication spectrum for smartphones and so on, air traffic control, a free trade zone for tourism, tax collection and banking, public health, right? If somebody gets COVID in Ramallah, Tel Aviv is going to be in serious trouble. We are in a world where if Israel tries to exercise jurisdiction in any of these things, the jurisdictions of the jurisdictions of the Palestinian state are equally going to be compromised. Now, you might say each state would be independent in foreign affairs, criminal law, health delivery, education, cultural affairs, and more. But think of all the places where states normally exercise jurisdiction if they are not doing it cooperatively, that is to say, with third-party institutions where they can negotiate their differences, we're going to be in serious trouble. And you can also say the same about a shared capital. When Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas negotiated the plan that they had proposed in 2008, 2009, they tried to deal with the question of Jerusalem. And what they came up with was, in effect, the only possible plan, which was an international custodian to handle what they called the Holy Basin. That is the Temple Mount and the area of excavations around the so-called City of David and the Mount of Olives. And at the same time, they decided that there was going to be a single municipality. There had to be a single municipality There was already a common infrastructure for a single municipality, and 50% of employed Palestinians in East Jerusalem were already working in West Jerusalem. So they could stipulate a dotted line border, but it was necessary to have a single administration for the city of Jerusalem. What is that single administration, if not a confederal institution? That's the kind of thing to which each sovereign state is contributing. And it's a place where serious negotiations are going to happen. Confederation isn't a kumbaya moment. You're still going to have politics. The point is that in order to have a shared capital, each side is going to have to also contribute to a single administrative secular capital. Now, I've spoken a lot about all the problems that have to be faced that a confederal structure solves. Let me talk, and I'll end with this, let me talk about the tremendous opportunities. It's important for us to recognize that economies today are not fortresses. They are networked hubs. I mean, I have here one of my favorite exhibits, which I'm not going to try to defend here, but it just look at the growth of what's called intangible assets in the S&P 500. The assets of companies today are the capacity to, through network effects, through education, through focus on science, through know-how and know-about, the assets of great companies today are, in effect, the capacity to create streams of profitable innovations over a long period of time. We aren't talking anymore about, two agricultural states fighting over the mountains to be able to farm in the valleys. That's not what the countries are. Even Palestine is less than 5% of GDP in agriculture. We have to focus on the businesses that can grow inside of the cities. The businesses that can grow inside, particularly of Palestinian cities. And, the Palestinians are graduating some 1,500 computer engineers a year. But that doesn't mean that they're ready to actually create value for global companies. There's something like $13 billion of investment in bank deposits. That is to say, Palestinian banks in the West Bank have something like $13 billion in bank deposits, but they can only lend about half of that because there aren't investable business plans that will allow Palestinian banks to invest and launch Palestinian businesses. Why? Because of the absence of intellectual capital, not financial capital. Money isn't the problem. There's probably $25 billion in Palestinian bank assets in Jordan and maybe 20 in Chile. Just think of all the assets of Palestinians in New Jersey and in Michigan. Money is not the problem. Intellectual capital is the problem. And it's almost inevitable that the investment climate in Palestine in its early years will be largely dependent on the ability of Palestinian entrepreneurs to learn from and partner with Israeli companies. Already something like 80% of Palestinian exports and imports are with Israel. Already there are Palestinian companies that are part of the supply chains of Israeli businesses, particularly in furniture making and food processing, plastic bags, all kinds of fundamental things that Israelis depend on. But at the same time, it's necessary, I think, to see the opportunities for Israeli entrepreneurs, because, you know, with the Abraham Accords, we see tremendous opportunity for Israelis to spread out into the markets of the Gulf states, the UAE, and obviously the great object would be Saudi Arabia. But about 1 million Palestinians have circulated through the Gulf states since 1948. That's why Amman is a real miracle in the desert in its own right. And if you're an Israeli entrepreneur and you want to take your business to Dubai or to Abu Dhabi, which are, by the way, within a 3-hour flight of 3 billion people, a great many of whom are in South Asia. If you're an Israeli company trying to take your step into these markets, having a Palestinian partner would be a tremendous opportunity to help you do the marketing, to help you create the network that you're going to need to be successful. I said I would close with that, but I do want to make one last point, because there is an issue about Palestinians who want to return and settlers who want to stay. If you have a confederal system, it's much more realistic to think about what might be called permanent residency in each other's states without citizenship. I mean, you know, in the European Union, if you're a Frenchman and you want to go work in the Netherlands, you don't become a citizen of the Netherlands, but you have a right to create residency for yourself there. You become a resident. It's perfectly feasible for a great many Palestinians to imagine returning to Israel and taking up permanent residency in Israel without necessarily becoming citizens, and vice versa. And by the way, we're talking about an area that's so small that if you're a permanent resident of Ma'ale Adumim, you can drive to vote in Mount Scopus in 7 minutes. And if you're a permanent resident of Lifta, you can drive to vote in East Jerusalem in, 10 minutes. That's because of traffic, not because of distance. So how can we think about this as a horizon? Confederation is a horizon. It's a different way of envisioning what a two-state solution really is, and it gives us the political horizon to think more creatively about what is now a stuck situation. I mean, I had a conversation with Prince Hassan of Jordan about 6 months ago, and he couldn't stop talking about the Red Sea Canal project, because he thinks that more than anything, the states in the area, which after all already share a common business ecosystem and a common urban infrastructure, should begin to create projects to which the 3 countries, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, can migrate into mutual cooperation and prove to everybody else that there are things that can be done, big things that can be done, that show the benefits of interdependency as well as the need for independence. So let me stop there and happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is a lot to take in and all very interesting. I'm wondering where to start. I do want to leave, some of the important questions to the audience. So I don't want to steal kind of the main issues from them. But you mentioned Jordan, and well, let me ask you this: the Israelis right now can hardly deal with with the paradox of having Arab citizens in a Jewish democracy, right? And let's not forget that Israel doesn't even have a constitution. On the other sides, you have the Palestinians are kind of torn between Fatah and Hamas, and a president who doesn't seem to be excited about democratic elections. So how can these two very messy sides, engage in such a venture of epic proportions, right? I mean, don't you think that this route has many hurdles and ways to fail? I mean, why not? Well, first go back to the two-state solution and maybe think of some sort of Middle Eastern NAFTA agreement, right, or a closed but permeable border like US and Canada. I mean, why choose an alternative that might seem less plausible to some than the ideas which precede it? And then perhaps to continue this question, this is also something that's floating around for a while, a Palestinian Jordanian Confederation, right? Wouldn't that be a sort of simpler way to bridge, right, the differences between identities and to kind of all the troubles and trials and tribulations in the past?
Well, you've already in a sense answered my question, but you thought I was presenting something else. The Confederation idea is merely an acknowledgement, as I said right from the start, that states have interests which can be pursued through various cooperative, in some cases, third-party institutions, which allow them to negotiate the things that are necessary for them. It's inconceivable that the state of Palestine will come into existence without a common market with Jordan. However, it's also inconceivable that they'll come into existence without a common market with Israel. Does this mean that Israel and Jordan therefore will enter into a common market? And the answer is probably. But this is all going to require a certain amount of negotiation. Because capital flows and intellectual capital flows, financial capital will be flowing back and forth between Palestine and Jordan for obvious reasons, because of so many Palestinian families. I mean, if you want to see what a Palestinian state looks like, go to Amman. 80% of Amman is Palestinian entrepreneurial accomplishment. And so if you want to get a feel for what a Palestinian state can be, imagine a city the size of Amman rising between Jerusalem, Ramallah, and Bethlehem and Hebron. That's what the Palestinian state is going to be. You're going to have a city the size of Amman rising on the hills down to the Dead Sea. Will that mean that Israel, Palestine, and Jordan should enter into a common market? Probably, but there may be some issues around, certainly there'll be issues around agricultural produce that will have to be negotiated because of the Jordan Valley and how the produce in the Jordan Valley will be marketed. Every confederation is ultimately a series of negotiations where states pursue their common interests. should Palestine and Jordan be a political confederation? I think that's unrealistic because of the differences in their political apparatus, their state apparatus. I mean, Jordan is still a monarchy. There's bad blood between the Hashemites and the Palestinians since basically the McMahon letters and you know, from 1915. There isn't going to be in the foreseeable future a united Palestinian Jordanian state. But that doesn't mean that Israel and the state of Palestine, that the state of Israel and the state of Palestine can't negotiate all kinds of arrangements which pertain to their mutual interests where Jordan is not involved, particularly around Jerusalem, but also around the economic ties that will evolve between Palestinian and Israeli entrepreneurs, also around the sharing of bandwidth, of electromagnetic spectrum, water. There are epidemiological problems that the two states are going to have to work out, and particularly the security arrangement. Here, the Jordanians could actually be constructive. They can play a constructive role because it's almost inevitable, well, it is inevitable, that the Israeli state would never agree to a militarized Palestine. And the only way you can guarantee that there will be a non-militarized Palestine is to make sure that the Jordanians are very careful about what crosses the Jordan River. So we're in a complicated series of arrangements. The one thing I want to come back to is, Roy, when you say, why not go back to a two-state solution? I am going back to a two-state solution. I'm trying to go back to one that actually is plausible enough to have worked and to put my finger on the reasons why the Oslo process broke down. And by the way, one of my most important allies in Israel right now is Yossi Beilin, who was the architect of the Oslo project and now recognizes very well that there can be no two-state solution that is not a confederal system.
Of course, yeah, and so let me take a question from the audience, and again remind everybody that there is a Q&A button at the lower right side of your screen where you can post questions. But this is one good reason, I think, to sort of illustrate your point of proposing a two-state solution just in a way that works with the problems that disable a two-state solution. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. He says, you are talking about two states. How do you deal with the West Bank and with Gaza that are two separate entities? So I think a confederate solution does offer something, right, to that question.
Well, look, Israel has a politics, Palestinians have a politics. Gaza, the West Bank, these are just sort of tokens right now for an internal fight on the ground for the hearts and minds of Palestinians. Actually, Hamas wanted very much to participate in the elections that were canceled in May. They think that they could probably win a majority in a Palestinian parliament. It's possible that they could at this point. One of the reasons why Abbas canceled that election is because it's not that he thinks that, the West Bank is separate and Gaza is separate. Both sides are trying to create an institutional unification. The reason why he canceled the election is because he knew he would lose. So this politics has to play itself out. But why is he losing? Why is it that only, according to Khalil Shikaki's polls, only 20% of Palestinians view Abbas with favor today? Because for 14 years, he's been hung out to dry. He's had to deal with an Israeli government which has been disingenuous about trying to pursue a two-state solution at all. And I'm not just speaking about this as some kind of outside observer. I'm a close friend of Ehud Olmert, and he is probably the greatest critic of the ways in which the Israeli government has, since his negotiations with Abbas, simply ignored all the accomplishments of his negotiations with Abbas in the fall of 2008. And he strongly believes that Israel could have achieved a two-state solution with some confederal arrangements, by the way, already being negotiated. That he could have had a peace with Abbas then in 2008. So Israel has been rather disingenuous about pursuing, I mean, it's Israel. I mean, we're talking about Bibi Netanyahu. We're talking about a decade of governments that have been in the hands of the settlers and have really surrendered to the settler side of the culture wars. So we have our own problems. It's not just Abbas having a problem with Hamas, right? You know, Meretz and Labor have a problem also with Bennett.
Oh, I mean, Bennett just spoke at the United Nations, and he did not mention the plight of the Palestinians whatsoever.
Well, he said that he's not going to ever permit a Palestinian state, unlike my predecessor, who kind of, dances around the question, we will never have a Palestinian state under my watch. He represents a version of Israel that's profoundly theocratic. And he sees Israel as moving toward an annexation of what he calls Judea and Samaria, which is just another phrase in the culture war, right? Once you get into the paradigm of Judea and Samaria and start thinking about your rights in the land as biblical, you're not talking to people who were the Zionist products of the Haskalah and the Enlightenment, right? So you have a culture war going on between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem also, and it's going to continue to be problematic on the Israeli side. It's also problematic on the Palestinian side. Are we going to move toward this in this atmosphere? Obviously not. Obviously not. But at least people who still believe in a two-state solution should have something to defend. Not simply defend the frustrated actions since Oslo. And that's really what a confederal model is meant to do. It's not to convince Naftali Bennett. He's not interested in a two-state solution. But Merav Michaeli and Nitzan Horowitz and the people who are in the government today who are defending a two-state solution, I'd probably even include Yair Lapid here, they need to have an anchor in reality so that when they talk about a two-state solution in the future, they're not talking about chasing the past that failed.
Right. Well, I think to maybe pose a question to that, Israelis are, and rightfully so, are in the sort of a perpetual mode of post-traumatic existential fear. I think security is probably the biggest Israeli concern when talking about a confederacy like that. And, I mean, we're not, after all, we're not Europe, we're in the bloody Middle East. You can't go into a shopping mall, right, in Tel Aviv without being almost strip searched. So will an Israeli government, let's say even as a part of a confederacy, let's say we pass that hurdle, will they allow this sort of free movement? I mean, don't you think that free movement between Tel Aviv, Ramallah, and Nablus will, you know, allow extremists to do all the damage they want to do?
I am not talking about free movement immediately. I'm talking about building towards something over a period of time. By the way, all this talk about being in the Middle East and not in Europe, do you remember what Europe was in the 20th century, for Christ's sake?
Yeah.
The first confederal system that began in Europe in 1952-53 was the Coal and Steel Union between Germany, France, and the Netherlands. Do you think that the French liked the Germans any more than Tel Aviv people like people in Ramallah? Let's get our heads on straight here. Israel, the Middle East, didn't invent human tragedy and human cruelty. The human species is not a huge success. We know that. The purpose of institutions like not just confederal institutions, but all institutions that we build that tries to mitigate violence, like liberal institutions. What is a liberal democracy if not a peace process without end? So all of the efforts we do, all of our efforts to build institutions of nonviolent resolution of dispute, all of those institutions have to assume in advance, as my late father used to say, kabdeu v'chashdeu, you know, honor him and suspect him. Honor him and suspect him. I think Ronald Reagan once had a Russian version of that. Test, but you know, something but verify. I forgot what was. It's the only thing about Ronald Reagan I think I ever would quote. But we have to think about the institutional parameters that allow for the resolution of violent dispute. Obviously, we're not going to remove the impediments that will create a terrorist-free Tel Aviv. By the way, there wouldn't be a terrorist-free Tel Aviv if not for the security cooperation with the PA, even right now. Even right now. It's just that it's not being openly developed. So let's focus on the creation of a collective security environment in which both sides are openly cooperating and marginalizing the crazies on each side. It shouldn't be up to the Palestinians to try to mitigate Baruch Goldstein. And it shouldn't be up to Israel to try to mitigate the attacks on the Park Hotel in Netanya. You have to have cooperation on both sides. And they're going to be, things are going to happen. There are going to be some grotesque acts. Some people will manage to get through and to do terrible things. And so we want to avoid polarization when that happens. That's the other point. But now I'm repeating myself.
I have a question from the audience, and again, I encourage you to submit questions in the Q&A section. The question goes: Will not the growing Arab population in Israel ultimately drive today's opponents to serious discussion of a two-state solution?
It's a great question. You know, the polls have shown again and again and again that the most reliable, largest group of people on both sides, Palestine and Israel, who are advocating for a two-state solution and don't give up on it are the Arab citizens of Israel, for reasons that may be self-evident. It doesn't mean that they want to live in Palestine, but for them to have a two-state solution with a lot of confederal institutions is like a dream come true for them, because it allows them to have Israeli citizenship, allows them to have, to some extent, serious identification with Israeli nationality. I mean, these are Hebrew-speaking people, third generation already, born in Israel, and speak Hebrew better than I do. Yet they can also move back and forth between Palestine and Israel and feel free to do so. You know, Ramallah, sorry, not Ramallah, Rawabi, the new town going up north of Ramallah, you know, it's about already 12,000 housing units. It's really a very remarkable new city. A great many of the apartments sold in Rawabi are to Palestinian citizens of Israel who come there on the weekend, who come to the hills of Palestine, and to escape the heat and the humidity and so on, and buy these apartments as a kind of escape.
I want to ask a question. I know there's a few open in the Q&A, but I'm keeping them for later, so I didn't forget about you. You know, just again to be sort of the devil's advocate. I think in any scenario of an Israeli Palestinian Confederation, we'll have to deal with numerous problems, and you did talk about some. What I fear most is you know, the economic disparity which exists, you know, that exists between Israel and Palestinians. And I know you gave a really sort of hopeful view towards what can be done, but I still wonder, in a sense, you know, we're sort of creating something like a confederation between, well, you talked about LA, so between California and Mississippi, or even think about East and West Germany, and the economic differences weren't
Santa Monica and South Central LA.
Sure, exactly. So how do you know? So we're trying to prevent, let's say, sort of what's going on today, a racial apartheid, right? But we might end up with an economic one, right? A sort of a uptown and a south side, right? Israel.
No, you won't wind up with it. You won't wind up with it. You're starting with it.
Yeah, starting with it, right? So you start with Israel as the strong player.
Right. Israeli GDP.
Make sure that. Sorry.
Israeli GDP per capita is about $50,000 a year. Palestinian is probably less than $5,000.
Exactly.
Okay.
So how do we prevent this sort of, you know, an expansion of a Palestinian workforce in Israel is not going to be immediately Palestinians in high tech, right, and high tech companies in Herzliya, but right now we have around 80,000 Palestinians workers in Israel, and most of them are in construction, or the rest are in the fields, or in, you know, or they wash dishes. So an expansion of Palestinian workforce can lead to, you know, this master servant economy.
Yeah, that's a bit of a stereotype. It's a bit of a stereotype.
I know.
Palestinian cities have a remarkable bourgeoisie, a remarkable professional and entrepreneurial class. Paltel is certainly a competitive telecom company, and the reason why it's not competing in the Israeli market is because it's being kept out by regulatory unfairness, because Cellcom is competing in the streets of Ramallah. And it has to do with the division of bandwidth and so on. I mean, you know, Paltel and Wataniya, the second cell phone company in Palestine, still can't move to 4G, certainly not to 5G, because they're not given the bandwidth, they're not given the spectrum to compete the way the Israeli companies are. But take a step back for a second, because your question, I think, is really about the proportion of people on both sides who are educated as opposed to the ones who aren't. First of all, let's not idealize Israel. Israel has graduates about 25, 28% of its people from university every year. There are very large populations of very poor Israelis. I'm trying to remember where I read exactly this data point, but the average Israeli salary is somewhere around 8,000 shekel a month, and that means that there's a tremendous disparity between the Israeli bourgeoisie and sort of the less educated, people coming from North African families, people coming from parts of the world which have not given them the kind of head start that, say, for example, came from Russia. Haredi communities are deeply undereducated, profoundly undereducated, and they're just growing and growing. So, there's a big disparity on the Israeli side too. The Palestinian bourgeoisie is proportionately smaller than the Israeli bourgeoisie, but it's a critical mass of people who could start a significant number of companies that could employ Palestinians in Palestine. But having said that, it's also not a terrible thing to have more Palestinians working in the Israeli economy. For many of them, it's a chance to gain skills that they could take back and start businesses where they are. If they're in hauling, if they're in construction, if they're in food processing and so on, it gives them an opportunity in retail. We also have to think about tourism. Israel, Jerusalem gets somewhere south of 3 million tourists a year. 3 million. Do you know how many tourists are in Prague?
No idea.
10 million. I mean, before COVID, right? Munich gets more than 10 million a year. So just think about what contributes to Palestinian GDP, the kinds of companies that will get launched if, as a result of a two-state solution and a confederal system where people can move back and forth between Palestine and Israel with banking systems that are reciprocal and are, and moving through a dotted line border. Just think about what this contributes to the Palestinian economy. We're talking about, possibly adding just add 4 million tourists a year. Just think of the hotels that get built. It'll give a bump to their common GDP, Palestine and Israel together, maybe 4, 8 billion. I mean, it's very hard. It's very hard to simply anticipate this, but it's certainly going to be a tremendous boost to the Palestinian economy to have a chance to be part of the tourist business ecosystem of Israel.
Internal tourism. I mean, it's not that Israelis are desperate to find new places around the world. And a visit to Bethlehem on the weekend doesn't sound half bad.
Right. And by the way, when you think about the high-tech world of Israel, you're talking about maybe 20% of sort of the cream of the population. Yeah. But there are a lot of companies in Israel that are much more low-tech. And Palestinians will need one of everything. It will be easy to imagine the lower-tech Israeli businesses, departments, supermarket chains, and and earth-moving contractors and so on, setting up to operate in Palestine and create partnerships with people who don't need PhDs in computer science, but set up partnerships that will allow for Israel also to participate in the development of the Palestinian economy. Money won't be the problem. Just remember that. Money will not be the problem. There'll be tremendous investments coming from the Gulf states, tremendous investments coming from the Palestinian diaspora. The real problem will be the know-how to create entrepreneurial businesses.
Yeah, and I mean, catch up in terms of infrastructure, roads. I mean, still Israel has, you know, the main ports and the railroads and the highways, right? But as you say, money will come in, and maybe that's I'll take a couple of questions from the audience now, which is a good could be a good connection. I'll conjoin too. The first question saying, I'm curious about how you think you know, grassroots movements such as Women in Black can, you know, do they or can contribute to actualizing this confederacy, and to join it with, you know, with another question: do you think that the U.S. administration then could be helpful in accomplishing the Confederate concept? I mean, what can we do here on the Western Hemisphere to help generate?
So it's a very good question. Look, groups like Women in Black, all the the NGOs that are working toward a two-state solution need a ray of hope. I think that all of these groups, whether it's Yesh Gvul or Lochamim L'Shalom, and, you know, the combatants for peace. I mean, there's so many groups I can think of off the top of my head that are working sincerely toward a two-state solution, but actually have given up hope in some way, because they don't really have, they're trying to sell goods from an empty cart. What do they really have to sell? That we should go back to the terms of the Oslo agreements and try harder? As if when the right says, yeah, and they want missiles at Ben Gurion Airport, as if the right is wrong. Of course we don't want missiles at Ben Gurion Airport. By the way, missiles against Ben Gurion Airport don't have to come from the West Bank. I think we realize that they can come from South Lebanon, they can come from, you know, from Gaza. So, you know, there's a lot of cliches that need to get updated. But anybody who's been involved in the two-state solution for the last 20 years needs a ray of hope. They need to start talking about two states in vivid enough terms so that the people who are afraid of missiles at Ben Gurion Airport, the people who are afraid about economic disparities, the people who are afraid about hatred on both sides, can begin to speak more concretely about what a two-state solution will actually look like, and the concrete steps each state can take to realize the forms of cooperation that are going to be necessary in order for people who are living in such small scale to actually live together, as far as what people in America can do. First of all, the role of people in America has, you know, if you haven't been in America kind of cheering on the settlers and cheering on biblical notions of Eretz Yisrael, you're probably in the 70% of the American Jewish population and the much larger group of people in the Democratic Party who've been trying to help incubate a two-state solution and contribute to it. We also need hope. Like, people in America also need hope. What can we do? Once you start thinking along these lines, there are obvious things. The most important thing I can think of right now is for the American government to pressure the Israeli government to allow Palestinians with capital and ideas to move back into Palestine and start building businesses. Do you know how hard it is for Palestinians to take up residency in the West Bank if you're coming from Michigan or if you're coming from New Jersey? Do you know how hard it is? My friend Sam Bachur, with whom I wrote this article, came from Youngstown, Ohio. It took him 15 years to get residency. He had to leave every 3 months to renew his tourist visa. And once he got Palestinian residency, he had to give up his American passport. I mean, it's preposterous how hard it is, how hard the Israelis have made how hard they've been on Palestinians who've tried to return, to do nothing more than to build up the spine of a Palestinian economy that will lead to a GDP per capita of maybe 7,000 or 8,000 a year rather than 5,000 a year. And this isn't a security problem for Israel. On the contrary, the more Palestinians have to lose, the better. Another obvious thing to do, which actually the Israeli military has been pretty good about, the gas to Gaza pipeline. You know, creating infrastructure in Gaza that will cool everyone's jets just a little bit, so that people in Gaza can have electricity more than 3 or 4 hours a day, can have desalinated water, so that the sewage systems can be pumped and cleaned. There are things that can be done that are called humanitarian, but are really just common sense. And then there's also the larger projects which the Biden administration could get behind, like the Red Sea, Dead Sea Canal, and so on. There are things that can be done, but you need to have a kind of vision. You need to have a kind of horizon of where this is all leading.
So I think we have a time for just a couple more questions that are there on the board, and it's again, it's a good continuation to your answer right now. It's from a faculty member here at the Jewish Studies Center, Dr. Patricia Sorn. She asked, do we know of what Gulf states such as United Emirates, Bahrain, etc., even Saudi Arabia, do they see a possibility of a confederal system for Israel and Palestinians? Will we have any form of support from the Gulf states?
Look, I can only answer the question sort of on a tangent. A friend of mine by the name of Enrique Zimmerman is the chairman of the Israel GCC Gulf Cooperation Council, Chamber of Commerce. He's been going back and forth to the Gulf, go back and forth between Israel and the Gulf and Israel and Jordan for a generation, and was very much pushing the Abraham Accords, which, by the way, I think are a remarkably good thing. For the Gulf states, the fact that Israel and the Palestinians have not resolved their differences, which is a kind of fancy way of saying they're still at war, is a tremendous embarrassment, because they want to work with Israel. It's not so much that they approve or disapprove of confederation as an idea. I'm sure they would want Palestinians and Israelis to enter into any kind of cooperative agreements that will allow for the Palestinian issue to drop from their agenda. They want something like a business ecosystem with Israel, because they're desperate to get out of being petrostates. They know that they're in a world which is moving very quickly away from fossil fuels. And, you know, the UAE is 10 million people, but it's only 1 million citizens at the top. And the rest are people coming largely from South Asia. These are very strange states, which, if they're not moving economically forward, if they're not creating, if they're not, in a sense, buying internal peace through economic development, are going to explode themselves. So they want cooperation with Israel. They have a lot of financial capital. Israeli intellectual capital is very valuable to them. They want that kind of help. They can get intellectual capital from America too, but Israel's only 4 hours away. You know, it's like the 4-hour flight. There's something about working with the Israelis and working with Palestinians and Israelis together that is a very appealing thing for them. It's a very appealing model. And Zimmerman has, you know, made clear that certainly they want this for the sake of Jordan, because they're afraid Jordan will fall. I mean, it's very important that the Jordanian regime be buttressed through economic development as well. The nightmare for the Gulf states is that somehow Jordan becomes a kind of new Lebanon, where I mean, it's a nightmare also for Israel, clearly, should be. Sometimes I don't think we're up enough at night worrying about this enough. But they're very much afraid that Jordan becomes another Lebanon, and Iranian influences through Islamist forces start penetrating into Jordan the same way that it did in Iraq. So it's, you know, for the UAE, the two-state solution, very important. Confederal arrangements for them are second nature. And, you know, preserving Jordan, you know, creating a kind of economic ecosystem in which intellectual capital is moving back and forth, not just between Israel and Palestine, but Israel and the UAE. It's all very, very much in their horizon. That's like in their wheelhouse. That's the way they think about the world.
So we have another question asking, is there anything that the Palestinians can do to encourage a resolution? Is there anyone on the Palestinian side that can promote a resolution without endangering themselves? And I know you wrote the column and you work with Sam Bahur. I know he's been talking also to congregations and universities and communities around the world. But how is it going really on that side? I remember there was actually a proposition by the Trump administration a few years ago, right, that came up to Mahmoud Abbas about idea of a confederate between Jordan and the Palestinians, right? So it's something that was on the table even on the Palestinian side for a long time. So it'll be interesting to hear about that.
Right. Look, when the Trump administration was promoting the idea of a confederation between Palestine and Jordan, what they really meant is they wanted the Jordanian army coming in and sort of guaranteeing the status quo through the reassertion of Jordanian power in the Palestinian territory, so that the weakness, the vulnerability of the PA would somehow be mitigated by Jordanian military power. I don't think, you know, Jared Kushner was thinking about the kind of confederation that we've been discussing here.
I mean, the answer was from only if it's Israel is included in the confederation, right? Only if it's going.
Oh, this is what Abbas answered. He said, said, yes, I'm interested in confederation, just not with Jordan. I want it with Israel. And you know, but you asked a very good question, which is, you know, are there forces on the Palestinian side that can promote the confederal idea, aside from Sam, who, you know, like me, came from America, is sort of thought of as, you know, half outsider. Sam is not the person to sort of carry the banner on the Palestinian side. But in a way, it's begging the question, because nobody talking about a two-state solution on the Palestinian side today is going to get a hearing. Because for the last 10 years, anybody who has talked about that has been terribly embarrassed. You know, the reason why, as I said before, the reason why Abbas is so unpopular, oh, sure, there's corruption. There was always corruption in the PA, even when the popularity of the PA was very high. There was always corruption in the PA because the group of, you know, Fatah people who came from Tunis took care of themselves. Let's put it this way. But the real reason why Abbas is so unpopular is because he's been promoting a two-state solution and promoting compromises with Israel, which have gotten him absolutely nowhere. He's been completely humiliated for 12 years. And as a result, nobody on the Palestinian side, particularly not as the Israeli occupation has sort of turned the screws under the Netanyahu governments, turned the screws more and more, you know, destroying communities in the South Hebron Hills, like, you know, my friend David Shulman is down there, Arik Asherman is down there all the time, witnessing what's happening to these communities. There are clashes all the time on the West Bank where the government tries to normalize new settlements, and there are clashes coming from the surrounding towns, and the Israeli army moves in, and, you know, dozens of Palestinians have been killed in demonstrations against new settlements over the last 2 years. So, you know, nobody on the Palestinian side is looking at the two-state solution and saying, yes, we can do business with these people. All they can think about is get rid of the occupation. Anything that promises to either abolish the occupation or stand up to it is going to get their hearing right now. And that's why Hamas is rising in popularity. Hamas, the Palestinian population is not Islamist. The Islamic community in Palestine was never greater proportionate to its population than the Haredi and National Orthodox have been in Israel. Maybe, as I said, 30%. Shikaki has been doing these polls for years, and Hamas has never gotten more than 32, 33%, and is, by the way, more popular in the West Bank than in Gaza, for obvious reasons, maybe. So, you know, Hamas is growing in popularity not because of its Islamic ideology, but because it seems to be the only group willing to sacrifice and oppose steadfastly the occupation. And you know, that's gonna be a real problem for the Israeli government going forward. And it'll be a problem for anybody promoting a two-state solution as well. But we don't know how quickly this could turn if, for example, Marwan Barghouti, who's still jailed, becomes the president of Palestine in an open election, which he would probably win if he were allowed to run. And if he were offered a serious series of proposals leading to a two-state solution, even with a lot of confederal ideas as contingencies, it's quite possible that he would become an advocate for it, for two states, and therefore for confederal relations. And that would just change the game entirely. It would change the game entirely. But we don't know how this is going to play out. Abbas is 85. He's not well. He's not going to. He may think he's going to live forever, but he's not. Neither am I, by the way. I don't think I'm going to live to see this. I don't think I'm going to live to see a confederation. I don't think I'm going to live to see a two-state solution, given all the things that are going on right now. But you know, in 1975, when some people in Israel, including myself as a kind of interloper, started talking about two states and talking about recognizing the PLO, that was like 25. It took 25 years for the things we were writing in 1975 to come true in 1990. So I may not have 25 years left, but I can see this as a horizon worth working toward over the next generation.
Of course, and you do your part. And I think this is, I have time for one last question. And it's also a question that I wanted to raise. It's been on the board since the beginning, but I think it's good to be good as the last one, because you're a college professor and this is an academic platform, and our campuses are very lively in terms of political discourse. And we see that the next generation of political leaders may very well be emerging for our classroom. So the question is, how might Israeli universities further the goal of the Confederation? And I also want to ask, do you feel that this idea is accepted by the younger generation, by campus activists, sort of being right a professor, a college professor in both sides of the ocean?
Look, it's again, I feel like the first step is getting students to recognize that the status quo is unsustainable. Young people coming out of the army, raised, I mean, don't forget, if you're in college today, you weren't even alive when the Oslo agreements were signed, right? The earliest memories you have of politics, possibly the earliest memories you have of politics, is the Al-Aqsa Intifada of 2002 to 2004. So the most important first step is to get young people to stop worrying about where to get the best latte and to think about how the status quo may not be sustainable after all. And we got a bit of a taste of that last May. We got a bit of a taste of that. Because for 10 years, basically Netanyahu was saying, we have the best of all possible worlds. We have the whole land. We have sheket. We have peace. All we want is calm. We don't need peace. We just need calm. We'll give calm for calm. And the Egyptians don't care about the Palestinians. The UAE doesn't care about the Saudis. Don't care about the Palestinians. We basically can have our cake and eat it. And suddenly in May, wow, missiles from Gaza, potential rockets from Gaza, potential guided missiles from Lebanon, the streets of Israel roiled by youth gangs coming from Israeli Arab cities, a potential new intifada on the West Bank, Jordan getting and like, ooh, maybe this status quo isn't as perfect as we thought. Once you get people thinking along the lines that maybe we have to refocus on the Palestinian issue, then the next question becomes, are you a liberal Democrat in your bones, or are you, do you think that you're doing, what God commanded? I like to believe that most universities are made up with a higher proportion of the latter, of the former than the latter, that more people who come to universities, actually believe in the limitations of human perception, believe in scientific doubt, believe in liberal principles, and don't believe that they're doing a divine command. I don't really have a lot of hope that people who are, as I said before, who see themselves, and there are college students who do believe it, but I think, if the vast majority of people, young people in Israeli society are secular in their bones, in the right way, secular in the sense of believing in individual conscience, individual freedom, and the limitation of our perceptions, and the fact that we need to have institutions of nonviolence. If that's the next step, then the step toward reviving a two-state solution becomes inevitable. And then the step of thinking about confederal relations as a way to realize a two-state solution, in my view, become inevitable as well. But I think that the culture war is actually going on at the universities in Israel today. And as I said before, the first step is to convince people.
And here in the States, how would the BDS movement, for example, see this idea of a Confederate? And I know it's sort of the time that we have, but I just wanted to pick on that last question on the board.
Well, the BDS, it's a big question. I mean, look, BDS, obviously the BDS movement, the way it's, the bundle of things called BDS, generally attached to, that bundle attaches to people who really question the legitimacy of Israel in the first place. But I think that there can be, if you unbundle BDS, which I think you should, you realize you're actually dealing with three very different things. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions are three different things. I don't think certain kinds of boycotts are terrible. I think I applaud Ben & Jerry's, for example. I do not buy stuff from the West Bank settlements. So, I think that's great. Do I believe in divesting from, I don't know, Caterpillar, because Caterpillar steam shovels that may have built a settlement, but we're also building roads in Ramallah, that should I divest from them as a way of showing my frustration with the occupation? I think it's ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous to divest from global companies which may be operating both in Israel and in Palestine, and our sanctions are yet another thing. I mean, do I think it's not a bad thing for, I don't know, a Swedish bank to be, or the Swedish government to be sanctioning the Israeli government over some aspect of the occupation? I don't think that's a bad thing either. So there may be different ways in which to pressure. Just remember one thing. Any form of pressure that is non-violent is legitimate, in my view. And we shouldn't think about BDS as being some, not BDS, but the sanction and boycott aspect of this as being somehow, terrorism by other means. That is so preposterous and does such an injustice to people who actually suffer from terrorism. And my own family is one family that has. the idea that somehow Ben & Jerry's is committing an act of, is supporting terror by trying to pressure the Israeli population to see the status quo as unsustainable, I think that's really absurd. And I think we should think of all nonviolent ways of ending the occupation.
Well, thank you. This is really all the time we have. I wish we could have continued this discussion. There's so much to talk about. I wanted, again, to thank you so much, Dr. Avishai, for taking the time to talk to us, to the students and the community. And, you know, I do hope that you will live to see, as some, if not a confederate of the two states, some sort of advancement in the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. I know we all really want to see something happening, no matter which political side we are on. So thanks again for joining. Thank you for the audience and the great questions that we had on the board. I'm glad that we managed to answer.
And tonight is Simchat Torah, so
yeah, so Chag Sameach.
Happy holiday to those who celebrate Simchat Torah. Bye.
Thank you, Bernard Avishai. Thank you so much.